The second note is to please ignore my sermon title. Something got a hold of me, and so I'm not doing that. I'm doing something else. In fact, I'm doing something else that begins in El Salvador. One of my favorite freelance journalists, a man named Danny Gold, who's based here in New York, he did a story from inside a prison in El Salvador late last year for PBS. He reported on how gangs like MS-13 and 18th Street typically divide the prisons in El Salvador, carrying over the bitter territorial divides in the cities to the prisons. Danny Gold wonders, is there a way out for these men from the lives that they are leading both inside and outside of prison? And he discovers that really the only way out often for these men is through Christianity. That within the prison system, there has been a huge movement over the course of the last few years to try and redirect many of these young men who have been in gangs towards a way that can provide them with some options. I've never seen a more spirit-filled, charismatic service than the one that depicted rows and rows of young men that people had given up on. Rows and rows of young men, tattoos covering their faces. And yes, rows and rows of young men who have contributed to the misery of many other people. They are, of course, part of the fabric that has driven people out of countries like El Salvador towards Mexico and then the United States. And it is those gang members who have found within this message and the message that we hear for today in the story of baptism that they have found a ritual way of being offered a new start. A washing away even as the tattoos remain. A washing away even as the pain of the past is present. A washing away not to erase that past but so that they can address it and find a second chance. It is a process of recovering an identity, an awareness of that for which you were born and just how far life has gone off the tracks. How gang life had robbed young men and women of their ability to care not just for people in their tribe, but in every tribe. A few drops of water can symbolize that. A narrative, a story, a rite, a prayer can symbolize all of that. To compel such a radical change within people once they have discovered an identity that feels that it is their deep story, their purpose, the sense of life, the sense that life can have meaning, that recovery is possible, that they had somehow been robbed of the belief that life is a miracle and that miracle had been restored to them is symbolized in baptism. Incredible, astonishing, miraculous. The waters of baptism wash over young men in places like El Salvador this day. The waters of baptism, of course, washed over the people that those young men forced to flee as well. I spoke to Robin Hoover earlier this week, who says that on Tuesday, another large caravan will leave San Pedro Sula, Honduras, potentially containing thousands of people, and will head towards Mexico. Those people presumably will also have been washed by the waters of baptism at some point in their lives, and they flee, fearful that their children cannot escape the gangs. They flee because the gangs have not enabled them to prosper. They flee because the police can't or won't help. They flee, many, I'm sure, knowing that even in the midst of fleeing, that God is with them. Life has conspired to deprive them of home, food, and prosperity. And I am struck by how often migrants will claim on their journeys that God willing, they will make it somewhere safe. God willing, they will be granted asylum. God with them now and always, no matter what. God with them everywhere, because that's who God is. Incredible, astonishing, miraculous. People on the move, believing that as they move, God moves with them. If you have heard the story of Jesus' baptism before, you might have noted that Luke's version seems a little different. It's not said concretely that John baptizes Jesus there. It doesn't even say, actually, that when Jesus was baptized, John the Baptist was present at all. Perhaps Luke is switching between time and places within the story, switching from baptism to John's imprisonment, and then goes back in time. But the gospel offers a picture that stands in contrast to the baptism. In contrast to the baptism, you'll note in Luke, John is imprisoned for preaching the good news. In contrast to the baptism, John is imprisoned for preaching the good news. And that good news is hurtful, harmful, and threatening enough to be confrontational to Herod. So much so that John is imprisoned. What's the word that John preaches that is so threatening? Herod the ruler, which is now Herod Antipas, the text says, who had been rebuked by him because of Herodias. That is almost certainly is because Herod Antipas divorced his first wife and married Herodias, who is her half-uncle, because it suited his desire to try and gain more territory and unite Judea so that he could be a king. He will spend his entire life pursuing that goal. Everyone knows he was using divorce just as a tool to gain power, and Herodias was complicit in that arrangement. And John the Baptist told two conniving, power-hungry power brokers that they were exactly those things, it would seem, that they had brought pain to others through their actions. And when people do that in any kind of public way for the wrong people, this is what happens. So in contrast to that, in contrast to John's imprisonment for simply speaking the truth, Jesus is then baptized, along with many others. And in prayer, a voice comes from heaven. As the staff of Union Kong are now probably incredibly tired of hearing, I have recently read Richard Rohr's spiritual interpretation of the Enneagram. As some of you know, I'm sure, how many of you heard of the Enneagram before? A fair few, good. As many of you obviously know, the Enneagram divides people into 9 different typologies, assigning numbers 1 through 9. And as with any methodology for saying, here, this is what people are like, there are flaws, there are imperfect matches, and a tendency to see things that aren't there in order to make ourselves fit one category or another. You can all take a test online, and it will tell you after 5 or 10 minutes what your number is. And yes, we ought to be suspicious of anything that can tell you what you are after knowing you for 5 minutes. But it will give you a number, 1 through 9. So I am a 3. Enneagram 3s tend to be concerned about what's the next rung on the ladder to climb, what success means, what next success can be attained. When the definition of success becomes murky, it can be an enormous challenge to feel whole. 3s tend not to enjoy their successes very much. They already have tomorrow's list cooking, even as they need to hear from someone else that their success that they undertook recently was wonderful and amazing and life-changing for others. So first of all, there are a bunch of 3s in here. That is my assumption. And also that in comparison to other countries, there are a lot of 3s in the United States. Culturally, we know we are, we should enjoy success more. Enjoy the view. Sure, got it. The tension in this construct is that, of course, those who see success as a way of defining worth have to know that they are worth something apart from any kind of experience or any kind of success they experience. It is a constant battle understanding worth quite apart from what you do or what you've done, and especially whatever it is that you think you are about to do. The voice comes from heaven telling Jesus he is God's beloved, with whom God is well pleased. Before Jesus has ever done a single thing in his ministry. For all the 3s, you need to hear that. Jesus is God's beloved before he has ever done a single thing in his ministry. fact, while it's usually translated as a present tense, with you I am well pleased, it's actually, in the original language, a simple past tense and can be simplified. In you, the voice from heaven says, I delighted. In you, I delighted. There is a cycling race held in Taiwan each year called the Taiwan KOM. It's an annual event that begins on the east coast of Taiwan near the beach, and it climbs up into the mountains. It finishes above 10,000 feet in elevation. It starts out gently along the shoreline for 15 or 20 miles, and then it turns inland, and it is basically uphill for almost 60 miles. As you pass 9,000 feet in elevation, there are parts of the road that hit a 27% incline. If you ever want to do this race, please bring me along, not so I can race with you, but so that I can pray for you. I watched a film of the Taiwan KOM this week. A Canadian journalist named Melanie Chambers was preparing to compete. And she talked about how nervous and excited she was, how her mouth was constantly dry, as you would expect. And then the conversation turned, and Melanie mentioned that her mom had passed away last year. She smiled and she said, I know this is going to be really hard, but I think Mom would love seeing me do this. When she rode her bike up the Taiwan KOM, she had a picture of her mom on her top tube on the bike, so that as she rode, every time she looked down, she could see her mom looking back at her. And when she got to the top, exhausted, completely finished physically, she talked about that strange place that we might find ourselves sometimes, where she was pushing herself beyond her limits, legs made of concrete, and tears streaming down her face as she rode, knowing that her mom would delight in her doing this crazy, beautiful, hard thing in the Taiwanese mountains. Just her, nature, her breath, and a picture of Mom on the top tube for company. I have a hard time imagining someone, anyone, God included, delighted in seeing me do something, or anything, really. I think that's apparently a part of being an Enneagram 3, and also just being part of an American culture. It doesn't matter what you do, there's always another rung. There's always something else. There's always another desire to fill, always the next. And I'm not suggesting they're wrong. I'm saying that for me, it is in remembering seeing my own child take their first steps, bake their first cake, ride their first bike. Could I ever begin to absorb the configuration of this verse? In you I delighted. Do you remember seeing, watching, noticing your child, your friend, completely and totally delighting in what they were doing? Jesus, before his ministry begins, hears, in you I delighted. Always you, forever you, here, right now, you. Before Jesus ever got started in that astonishing, in that miraculous, in that incredible ministry that God gave to him, as the waters of baptism washed his body, a voice from heaven came to him, in you I delighted. You were already worth it. And you're going to need to know that because you have just seen what happened to John the Baptist. There will be no easy answers, no easy path, but a path adorned by the love of God. In you I delighted. And that path is now being worn by migrants and refugees, and in them God delights. And in your co-workers and your colleagues and in your neighbors, in them God delights. In your patients or your clients, your children or your parents, in you God has delighted. May you ride your race this week and glance down at your top tube and know that in you the creator of the universe delights. May you touch water, that beautiful, incredible, free gift from your creator, from the faucet or from the shower, and as it falls from the sky, and know that in you the creator of the universe delights. And may you, when you see the news once again, the beautiful people of Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico and the United States are all people who are worth it. And in them all God has delighted, worthy of dignity and honor, not because of what they did, but because of who God is.